When you think of likely terrorist targets in the United States, you think of places where it's happened before, New York, Washington, or other big cities like Chicago or Los Angeles. But a small town in Ohio? That's where, long before 9/11, authorities found a huge cache of explosives and weapons. The accidental discovery in a self-storage facility left federal agents scratching their heads. Whose weapons were they, and how exactly were they going to be used? It's a mystery that took years of tireless investigation to solve. Here's John Hockenberry.
Bedford, Ohio is on the road to nowhere. A little town where the freight train stops only once a day. Few would call this place a destination. Not so long ago, you would have gotten laughs if you had suggested this bedroom community had any connection to a global terrorist network. All the people who live in Bedford, Ohio could have fit into the World Trade Center with room to spare. But long before the attack on the Twin Towers, investigators believed this town had its own very real brush with terrorism. It also happened on a September morning, back in 1996.
September 13th, it was Friday the 13th, and I was waiting for the black cat to jump out from around the corner.
You're superstitious?
Not very, but a little.
Pete Elliott is a special agent for the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF. Based in nearby Cleveland, he works mostly violent crime cases involving firearms and explosives. But he was about to embark on a case like none he had ever seen.
What began as a routine case would take 4 years to solve. In the end, it would bring renewed attention to a shadowy world where terrorists out for revenge used bombs and assassinations for a cause they believed was just. And it would lead to suspicions that a prominent member of a northern Ohio community, a man with influence and friendships at the highest levels of the U.S. government, was somehow connected. A man who thought his secrets were safely locked away, even from a dogged federal agent by the name of Pete Elliott.
It started with a seemingly ordinary phone call just after 10 in the morning from the Bedford police. At the time, Pete Elliott didn't think it would be a big deal.
Typically, or weekly, as ATF agents, we deal with firearms and explosives.
Bedford Police.
The Bedford police told Elliott they had just gotten an urgent call from a local business. For veteran detective Tim Alexiak, it was anything but routine.
I suppose you get a lot of calls as a local cop, and some of them are bigger deals than what it sounds like on the call, and some are smaller deals than what it sounds like on the call.
That's right.
Where did this one fit?
This was in the top 10.
The police had been alerted by the manager of a self-service storage facility on the edge of town. Someone who had rented one of the units had stopped making payments. After waiting 6 months, the manager got annoyed, cut the lock off, and opened the door. Then she called police.
There was a real sense of urgency, a real sense of urgency. We didn't know exactly what we had until we got there. I was one of the first officers on the scene.
Pete Elliott arrived just behind Alexiak. Inside the locker, they found boxes containing an estimated 100 pounds of explosives and blasting caps, and more than a dozen weapons, including an Uzi submachine gun, an unusual shotgun with a double trigger, and a rifle with an odd design on it. They also found a bank deposit envelope and an old trench coat. Those items would get a lot of interest later, but it was the dynamite that got everyone's attention that morning.
What state were they in?
A bad state, deteriorating, leaking, crystallizing. On the boxes, we can tell that they were manufactured in 1976. So we knew we had old dynamite.
So essentially what you're telling me is that that storage unit, all by itself, was a bomb.
Absolutely.
A bomb whose potential destructive power became apparent immediately. The storage locker was just over the fence from a gas station and right next to an interstate. Across the street was a daycare center. And just down the block was a school.
Is it illegal to have explosives in a storage unit?
Yes, definitely. And in this case, 20-year-old explosives next to a gas station and a daycare center or school, definitely illegal.
Ironically, on the boxes of blasting caps was a less than subtle reminder that explosives and children don't mix. Bob Reed was the Bedford police chief in charge of the scene that morning.
How many people do you think were threatened on that day?
Well, you have a student population of about 300 at the elementary school.
and the daycare, I believe there were 75 to 100 kids there. The interstate highway, which is close, you have thousands a day that go by there. So that particular day, it'd have to be at least 750 people that were at the possibility of an explosion and of a tragedy.
Everyone's nerves were on edge. No one who responded to the call had seen anything like it. Tim Alexiak grew even more concerned after he talked to the bomb squad technician on the scene.
I've never had that situation before where a bomb tech would actually say, I only want myself and one other bomb person here. I want everybody else out of here. It's never happened before. So we knew it was a very volatile situation at that point.
Dynamite gets more unstable over time. ATF experts would later say that the explosives were so volatile, a bug crawling across this dynamite might have been enough to set it all off.
It leaked all over and you got nitrogen.
The ATF and the local bomb squad knew they had to get rid of the dynamite, and fast. The highway was closed, the children evacuated. Then the explosives were removed from their boxes and taken out of town. Bob Reed was there when they were detonated.
It was huge. This mushroom cloud had to go 75, 100 feet in the air, and I mean, it just mushroomed, and the ground shook.
You felt this one in your bones.
Oh, absolutely.
It was the sound of dodging a bullet.
Yeah.
Bedford, Ohio was out of danger, but somehow its homespun tranquility had attracted someone with 100 pounds of explosives and a small arsenal. Who and what had been hiding out in Bedford?
We were totally clueless the first day, literally. We didn't know what we had to go on.
My initial thoughts that day is it had to be somebody back in the early 1980s. More than likely was mob related. It's somebody that is in jail now, going to get out, and going to save this stuff for a rainy day. Why else would you keep it around for that many years?
The lease records for the locker didn't seem to be of much help. All the names on the lease were fake. At one point, the renter had listed an address, but it was for this convenience store in a nearby suburb. Elliott couldn't find a connection, so he zeroed in on the unusual way the rent had always been paid.
Always in cash, never in check, or never leaving a trail behind. So
But there was an actual person with that money coming to that storage unit
absolutely.
every month or periodically to make those payments.
Right, right.
Regular cash payments made in person meant there might be a witness. Elliott discovered that indeed a manager at the storage facility was able to give ATF agents a description of the woman who would come in monthly to pay the rent in cash. Elliott thought he had his first break in the case.
The manager said that this female would be in her 50s now, was small, about 5'2", petite, dark complected, dark hair, dark eyes. So we had a sketch, we had a composite of a female that was making the payments between 1983 and 1989.
You looked at the sketch. Right. Did you think that it had any value in terms of solving this crime?
At the beginning, no.
No.
It looked like a 35, 40-year-old female. It was a pretty typical composite.
About 1 in a billion.
Exactly.
So it wasn't surprising that when the ATF released the composite to the local media, no one called saying they recognized her. It looked like this lead was another dead end. But Pete Elliott would not give up.
I've always been under the belief, and I learned a long time ago, that everything in life can be traced. And even when you think nobody's looking at you, somebody's watching you. And that you always leave behind clues, no matter what.
Always.
Always.
Being a cop is in Pete Elliott's bones. His great-grandfather was a police chief. His father was a deputy sheriff and later a U.S. Marshal. Even after Pete himself joined the U.S. Marshal Service, he had his sights set on joining the ATF.
It was my first choice, you know, and I take pride in being an ATF agent. I take pride in working violent crime. And I think we have one of the toughest jobs in the country in law enforcement.
He is a dedicated and deeply religious man who relies on his faith when the going gets tough.
You know, I believe everything happens for a reason and a purpose, and I believe there's a reason I was supposed to be there that day.
And discovering that reason became Pete Elliott's mission as a detective. Faith, some good police work, and maybe some lucky breaks, Elliott believed, would crack the case. So when the police drawing failed to turn up any suspects, Elliott tried to run a trace on the 13 weapons which had been in the locker with the dynamite. The trouble was most were so old they were untraceable, all except for the Winchester-type rifle with that unique carving on the stock.
And that traced back to a female that was no longer residing in the Cleveland area.
The woman who bought the rifle was now living in rural West Virginia. So with his composite in hand, Elliott set off to find her, driving through the hills and valleys of Appalachia. He spent hours looking for the right house, daring to think he was about to arrest the woman who had rented the locker.
And I'm thinking, wow, this is a quick case. It's over. We've got her.
But the woman who answered the door not only didn't match the composite, she also didn't know anything about a storage locker or about the dynamite inside.
So I'm figuring at that point you're going, well, this might have been a lot of wasted gas spent going to West Virginia.
Right.
So
Until we sat down and talked with her.
The woman did know something about the rifle with the unusual carving on the stock. She said her son had sold the gun to her old boss, a man whom she knew by the nickname Moose. Moose owned a convenience store near Cleveland, the one with the same address that had been listed on the storage locker rental agreement.
all of a sudden out here in the middle of West Virginia, there's the address again.
Right.
Now I'm betting the hairs on the back of your neck are starting to stand up.
Absolutely.
Really?
Yeah. Knew I was onto something then.
As soon as he got back to Cleveland, Elliott ran a check on the store's owner, whose last name was Topolian, and a search of Ohio driver's license records turned up a woman named Lucy Topolian, whose description sounded very familiar.
5'2", slender build, dark hair, dark eyes, age in her 50s now. All that matched up to Lucy Topolian.
To be sure he was on the right track, he compared the handwriting on the storage locker lease with the signature on Lucy Topolian's apartment lease. An expert said it was a match. The same person had signed both documents.
So, within a month and 2 days after you opened the storage unit, you know who the woman is.
Absolutely.
Now how are you feeling in your gut?
We knew. We knew we had her then. But why? Why would a female have 200 pounds of explosives, 13 firearms, a trench coat, all this stuff? Why? So we had to find out.
By October of 1996, just a month after a deadly mystery nearly exploded in the town of Bedford, Ohio, Pete Elliott thought he'd solved it. He had developed important clues about one of the rifles that had been confiscated. And armed with a composite, he and Detective Tim Alexiak went to the suburban Cleveland apartment of Lucy Topolian, the woman they believed had rented the storage locker. It was a tense moment.
We knock on the door, a female answers, and it was pretty astonishing that after all that time, she still looked very similar to that composite. And that was a huge break, and you want to jump out of your skin at that time, but you can't.
Once again, just like when you went to the door in West Virginia, you were praying as an investigator that we were going to see a short, kind of salt and pepper haired, in her 50s, Mediterranean-looking lady, right?
Right.
Did we find her?
We found her.
More surprising than what she looked like is what she had to say. Lucy was once married to Mourat Topolian, the owner of the convenience store, whose nickname she said was Moose. Her former husband had asked her to secretly rent the locker, but she insisted she never knew what was inside. She had used fake names to cover herself, but Pete Elliott was still skeptical. Lucy lied when she rented the locker. How could he be sure she wasn't lying now?
I wanted to corroborate what Lucy Topolian was saying, and we had her place a phone call to her ex-husband, who is now residing in Miami.
Hello?
Is Mourat there?
Yeah, hold on again for you.
Okay, thank you.
How did you convince her to do something like that?
She was scared to death at that time, agreed to cooperate, especially when we told her that the storage unit, where it was, across from a daycare center. She couldn't believe it.
The two investigators listened in on the conversation as Lucy talked to an abruptly uneasy Murad.
Yeah, listen, the police were here earlier today. Like, they were asking me questions about that storage locker in Bedford. Why didn't you tell me what stuff was in there?
Oh, Lucy.
What? I'm scared to death.
Oh, man.
There was enough explosives in that room to blow up the whole friggin' block. Jesus, Murad. I mean, that's
Lucy,
insane.
please,
You had 5
please,
minutes.
please. I'll fly back up there and I'll talk to you. But not over the phone, please. For your sake. For my sake and for the kid's sake.
His willingness to take a flight back up to Cleveland as soon as he could to talk to her in person, to me that sends all the keys in the world that something's wrong here.
We were both thinking, I think we were both thinking the same thing. He knows what's going on, and there's a lot more to this story, and we're going to find out what it is.
Topolian flew to Cleveland the very next day, and realizing that she herself might be facing charges, Lucy agreed to wear a wire to a breakfast meeting with her former husband.
I'm the one that's going to get screwed.
The two investigators hoped to hear Topolian tell all as they listened from the parking lot of this restaurant outside Cleveland.
I didn't know what was in there.
You didn't know what was in there? Who put it in there? You have to know that.
Yeah, well, somebody had asked me to rent that. One of the guys from overseas, and they said just forget about it.
You didn't know there were guns and ammunition?
Everything he said was suspicious, but more than that, it was cautious. Pete Elliott could hear that Topolian was saying nothing incriminating. There was no federal case to be made yet.
We didn't have any concrete evidence that he was the one responsible for the inside contents of that storage unit. So we had a big hurdle to go over.
As the conversation inside the restaurant went on, the two investigators heard tantalizing hints that this Mourat Topolian had a mysterious sideline and previous brushes with the feds.
Remember those two FBI guys that came many years ago?
I had FBI guys so many different times that come in and talk to me.
Elliott was flabbergasted. Why would the FBI have been so interested in this convenience store owner? And as he talked, Topolian himself seemed to be acting like he was some kind of target.
They're going to go after you. They're using you to get me.
Why would they want to get you?
Because I'm the head of the Armenian National Committee.
The Armenian National Committee. The two listening investigators drew a blank.
I had no idea where Armenia was, to be honest. I didn't know anything about Armenia at that point.
You know where it is now.
Oh, yeah.
The investigators were now entering uncharted waters. The door to that storage locker full of explosives had suddenly opened onto a world of twisted global politics. The two investigators would soon get a crash course in geography and history to learn of a century-old hatred with roots half a world away.
Armenia is a small country, once part of the Soviet Union, which sits between the Caspian and Black Seas. But the Armenian people have historically laid claim to a much larger area, including part of present-day Turkey. The dispute between the Armenians and the Turks erupted into one of the bloodiest ethnic conflicts of the 20th century. The Armenians accused the Turks of murdering up to 1.5 million Armenians between 1915 and 1923. It was an ethnic cleansing operation that many historians believe was the worst case of genocide before the Holocaust. The Turks dispute the number of people killed, and they reject accusations of genocide. The killings and the history remain largely unknown to a global audience. But it is the defining historical event for 1 million Americans of Armenian descent. People like Mourat Topolian, whose family lived in Armenia at the time of the killings. His grandparents were tortured and hanged by the Turks.
I miss my grandparents. I miss my uncles. I miss my aunts.
The investigators learned that Topolian had traveled the country, repeating the story about his ancestors, raising millions of dollars to promote awareness of Armenia and its people's plight. He also took his case to Washington, lobbying Congress and top officials throughout the government. He was very successful, not only in gaining their sympathy and understanding. He had a hand in helping make Armenia one of the largest per capita recipients of U.S. foreign aid.
We knew we were dealing with somebody that just wasn't your average guy off the streets.
The man who Pete Elliott first thought was just a convenience store owner named Moose was turning out to be a man with friends in some very high places.
Federal agent Pete Elliott has spent months searching for the person who left 100 pounds of volatile explosives in a small-town storage locker. He's traced the lethal stash to a man who once owned a local convenience store. But digging deeper, Agent Elliott has learned the man whose nickname was Moose has some extraordinary connections to an underground terror network and to the nation's highest corridors of power. Here again, John Hockenberry.
As Pete Elliott listened to that breakfast meeting between Mourat Topolian and his former wife Lucy, it became clear that Topolian was a man with powerful connections. According to ATF transcripts of the conversation, Mourat told Lucy he was supposed to be somewhere far more important than the Bob Evans restaurant in Cleveland.
He said he was supposed to be in the White House that day. We started to find out who Mourat Topolian was that day.
For instance, that Topolian was no stranger to Bill Clinton's White House. He had visited the White House complex nearly 24 times between 1993 and 1996, according to government records. He attended at least 2 gatherings with Mr. Clinton himself, At one meeting, he sat just one chair away from the president.
Did you ever figure he was too big of a fish, that he'd get away, that he'd somehow undermine your efforts? This is a guy who visited the White House more than once.
Right.
A lot more than once.
Right. I was concerned. I was definitely concerned. I was told by witnesses during this case that they were told by him that I was going to be transferred during this case, that there was no case against him, that this case was a farce and was not going to be going anywhere.
Topolian's resume looked squeaky clean, above reproach. He was a lecturer at the State Department, someone who had testified before Congress, an upstanding vice president of a community college. But Pete Elliott was convinced there was another side to Mourat Topolian.
I'm seeing somebody saying to himself, "You're coming down, buddy. I don't care how long it takes."
If he's guilty, he's coming down, correct.
Mourat Topolian, a man with powerful allies, versus Pete Elliott, an unheralded middleman at the beleaguered ATF. But to Elliott, this was an opportunity. He would prove his own investigative skills and help repair the reputation of the ATF, stinging from high-profile debacles at Ruby Ridge and Waco.
You made a vow that this case was not going to turn out like some others.
Right. Last thing I wanted was to, not prove this case and have the media and have everybody else looking at this thing and saying, well, the ATF should have never been involved. I haven't forgotten anything after Waco happened and how low our morale was.
But at this moment, in the fall of '96, you're carrying the flag for the whole agency for a minute or two.
I felt that way.
It's amazing that all these objects here tell a story.
Everything left behind something, some type of clue.
But would those clues provide the answer to two key questions? Why would a prominent person like Mourat Topolian have a locker full of explosives and guns? And what connection might the locker have with Armenia? Remember what Topolian had told his former wife on that hidden camera tape.
I didn't know what was in there.
We had an obstacle on our hands. We had to show somebody had knowledge of the inside contents of that storage unit to make it a prosecutable case.
Clearly 100 pounds of dynamite would not be easy to overlook if it were stacked in boxes inside a small locker, nor would the danger it posed be easily ignored. We asked the ATF to show us how much damage 100 pounds of dynamite could do. Notice how careful these experienced people are. Then remember that the dynamite inside the locker had begun to crystallize and had become highly unstable. Pete Elliott knew the danger, and he was determined to find out who had left the explosives behind. Although the original dynamite inside the locker had been destroyed, Elliott had kept the boxes, which still had on them something called the shift date code. The code acts as a kind of fingerprint, allowing the explosives to be tracked to the manufacturer. ATF records showed this particular dynamite had been stolen in 1976 from a construction site in Michigan. Nearly 2 decades had passed, and the case was never solved. Poring through the case file, Elliott found one of the prime suspects. But would he talk?
It's all how you ask questions and present questions. I ask everybody right off the bat, do you believe in God? Do you believe that there's a purpose for everything? And boom, he did the right thing.
And a secret locked away for years becomes another piece in Pete Elliott's emerging puzzle. The man said he'd been hired in 1976 by Mourat Topolian to acquire the explosives and have them delivered to Cleveland.
So suddenly you had witnesses against Topolian.
Right.
You had connections from the explosives to Topolian. What about the weapons?
We were able to develop a number of witnesses that could show Mr. Topolian possessed and in some cases requested certain firearms, and we were able to link those directly to Mourat Topolian and place them right in his hands.
But what, if anything, did Topolian do with the weapons? As Elliott crisscrossed the country, one witness led to another. He began to hear unbelievable stories about a large group of people who had formed a network in the 1970s, a network of terrorists which operated throughout Europe and North America.
What did you begin to learn?
I learned that between 1975 and 1985 that there was a number of unsolved bombings. There was a number of unsolved assassinations that took place.
It was a wave of terrorism which swept across Europe and North America during the 70s and 80s, all aimed at Turkish officials and businesses. Armenian groups claimed responsibility for assassinations of Turkish officials in the Netherlands, France, and Canada, as well as bombings in London, Paris, Los Angeles, and New York. But were they connected? Elliott was able to link the explosives from the storage unit with 2 bombings in 1981, one outside the Turkish consulate and another at the convention center in Anaheim, California.
All of a sudden, the explosives in the storage unit have in common explosives that have been used in actual terrorist incidents.
All directed at Turkish individuals.
All directed at Turkish individuals, most, if not all, with Armenian suspects.
Correct.
Armenian extremists at the time claimed responsibility for the attack, saying they were designed to avenge the millions of Armenians murdered in 1915. Elliott learned that some of the crimes in the U.S. were carried out by the youngest members of that network, many of them teenagers at the time, who were devoted to the Armenian cause.
Every single Armenian witness that I interviewed believed in their hearts and in their minds that the genocide took place and that their cause was legitimate.
These previously classified documents obtained by Dateline show that as early as 1981, the FBI was aware of an underground organization of Armenians, a network in which members anticipated orders to shoot or bomb someone. In a chilling echo of al-Qaeda's tactics, according to Elliott, the witnesses said that many of them were sent to training camps as far away as Beirut, Lebanon. They were taught a variety of skills, including specialized training in how to use guns and explosives, techniques of disguise and infiltration, all useful for staging attacks.
They'd go in and infiltrate Turkish ambassadors' offices. They'd dress up, in some instances, like a Turkish reporter. They'd surveil everything in there and come back and report it back to one person.
Members of the network told Elliott they had used those very skills in a brazen attack 20 years ago at the United Nations. The area around the United Nations is ordinarily quiet on a Sunday afternoon. October 12, 1980 was no different. Only a few strollers out and about. So it wasn't surprising that no one noticed a blue Chevy parked just outside the Turkish mission to the UN, just across from the main headquarters. Inside the car, someone had packed 5 sticks of dynamite. Not much compared to the 100 pounds of explosives left inside the storage locker in Ohio. But as the ATF showed us, even a 5-stick car bomb creates an enormous blast.
The bomb outside the Turkish mission went off at about 10 in the morning. 3 people were seriously hurt, and the building was severely damaged.
I saw a sheet of flame come up from the car, pieces flying in all directions.
Not long after the New York blast, a group calling itself the Justice Commandos for the Armenian Genocide claimed credit for the attack, as well as attacks that same day in London and Los Angeles. But the UN attack was by far the most serious.
Mr. Topolian had sent a number of people to canvass the United Nations prior to that bombing. They reported back to one person, and that person was Mr. Topolian.
Elliott says he was told that Topolian was directly involved in planning the operation, had hand-delivered the dynamite, and personally directed planting the car bomb.
Now you're about as far as you can get from your original theory of the Cleveland Mafia.
Right.
And it's beginning to look like some sort of international terrorism network.
Yes, definitely.
Pete Elliott was discovering that Mourat Topolian was not just a man who could use his charisma to schmooze with the President of the United States and members of Congress. According to people who knew him, he was also a man who could use that charisma to mobilize others to violence in the name of the Armenian cause.
I can tell you that every single Armenian told me stories about their grandparents and about their relatives and how generations were cut off. I heard it. I saw their tears. I saw them cry. I saw some of them fall to the ground, and these were bombers. These were people that handled explosives. I heard them. They had a lot of respect for Mr. Topolian.
But the Armenian activists who had been willing to help plan and execute bombing attacks in the 80s had become teachers, doctors, and bankers by the 90s. They thought they had put their violent past behind them.
These witnesses described Topolian as a leader, as someone they were emotionally connected to. Why the heck did they talk to you?
They're different people now. They worked for their cause. They didn't have anything to lose 25 years ago, but today they did.
Elliott wasn't the first to think Topolian might have been involved in the New York bombing. In 1988, he was questioned about it by the FBI, but denied participating in the attack. The witnesses now talking to Pete Elliott were telling a different story. In almost every case, he says, the witnesses decided to come forward only after they were told that the abandoned explosives had been left in a place that posed so much danger to so many people.
They couldn't believe Mr. Topolian was stupid enough to still have these explosives, but more stupid to keep them next to a daycare center, a gas station, and a school.
You've been investigating this case. You've been talking to everybody. These are people with bombs. Were you worried about something happening to you?
I guess that's always in the back of your mind, and I believe you become numb to potentially what could happen to you. There was never any direct threats towards me.
But some militant members of the Armenian community were worried about what Topolian might say if he was ever taken into custody. Silencing a former leader suddenly looked like a good idea.
Word was out that Mr. Topolian, if he would talk, could potentially put together a lot of Armenian crimes directed at the Turks from years and years ago.
So you were concerned at this point that suddenly this guy with the bullseye around his head that you've been tracking could possibly be killed?
Yes.
The year-long pursuit between Pete Elliott, the hunter, and Mourat Topolian, the hunted, had reached a crossroads. But if he was to warn Topolian, Elliott would have to knock on Topolian's front door and meet him face to face.
What happened when you identified yourself as Agent Pete Elliott of the ATF?
I think he looked completely in shock. I said, listen, I did receive information that your life could potentially be in danger. I'm going to give you the opportunity. You want to sit down and talk to me? We can try to work this whole thing out. And he never took me up on that offer.
Instead, Elliott says Topolian dared Elliott to make his case or drop the investigation altogether. Elliott knew he needed airtight evidence. He began to wonder if there had been something else, some other clue inside the locker that perhaps he had overlooked, something that would prove that Topolian knew what was in there. What about that bank deposit envelope he'd found on top of one of the boxes of dynamite?
The address was 25890 Emory Road in Warrensville Heights, from a Cleveland trust that went out of business, I believe, in about 1979. I was able to dig and find out that Mourat Topolian had an account at that specific branch.
What's more, the bank branch had been just a few doors down from Topolian's convenience store. One more piece of the puzzle. But it still wasn't enough. Then Elliott remembered the final item he'd found in the locker, the torn trench coat lying on top of the explosives boxes.
Sent that up to our ATF lab, and they were able to find two very old hairs from 20 years ago that were inside one of the sleeves, I believe, of that coat.
Elliott had the hairs sent to a lab for DNA analysis. It was a long shot, but he knew the results could be critical to the case.
I still remember the day when I received a call from the lab, and I think they had to actually pull me out of the roof of my building because I jumped so high when they told me it matched up to Mr. Topolian's.
It was the last decisive piece in what seemed like a 1,000-piece puzzle. Elliott finally had the evidence he needed to make an arrest.
Went relatively pretty easy. He got out of his car. I walked up to him, and I told him he was under arrest. He was in complete and utter shock.
Do you remember what you said to Pete Elliott at that moment?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we did. We shook hands, and we said we did it. We did what we had to do. We did what we wanted to do.
We did it. We did what we wanted to do. So, burgers or pizza for lunch?
That's about it. That's about right. That's exactly right.
After a relentless 4-year investigation, federal agent Pete Elliott has finally made an arrest in the mystery of the abandoned storage locker packed with deadly explosives, machine guns, and other weapons. But after so many years, would the suspect, Mourat Topolian, face justice? Here again, John Hockenberry.
The wave of Armenian terrorism against Turkish interests in the United States ended in the mid-'80s. Pete Elliott's investigation had stirred up memories that no doubt many hoped had finally faded away. As for Mourat Topolian, he was charged with numerous crimes, including conspiracy to steal, transport, and use explosives. The government said he had planned acts of violence against Turkish government facilities and businesses and people of Turkish descent. But he was never convicted of conspiracy or any acts of violence, including the bombing at the United Nations. Topolian pled guilty to storing stolen explosives and possession of machine guns. In January 2001, he was given the maximum sentence of 37 months in prison. In a letter to the judge, Topolian said the locker was supposed to be used to store records of people contributing to the Armenian cause, and he insisted the locker had not been opened for 15 years. Topolian always claimed that Pete Elliott's investigation was designed to discredit the Armenian cause. We don't know now if Topolian still thinks what he did to further that cause was just. He declined repeated requests for an interview. Nor do we know if he expected his powerful political connections to somehow shield him from prosecution, or if he figured there was just no way to trace him to that abandoned storage room back in Bedford. One thing is certain: Mourat Topolian didn't figure on ATF agent Pete Elliott.
I looked and I didn't quit. I just kept digging, I kept digging, and I kept digging.
But maybe that's one of the lessons here. That powerful people, like Topolian,
right,
sometimes get a pass, but they don't get a pass from an agent who's willing to go all the way for the truth.
It may be a day, it may be a month, it may be a year, but it could be 25 years later that people, the government, could come back in your life and make you accountable for your actions that happened 25 years ago.
2 years ago, President Bush named Pete Elliott U.S. Marshal for Cleveland, Ohio. Mourat Topolian was released from federal prison in 2003 and is still under law enforcement supervision until September of next year.